Namaste. Good morning. Dr. Soham, today's distinguished speaker, Dr. Geetesh Nirban, co-convener of the webinar series, distinguished invitees, and dear friends. I welcome you all to the 36th session of this series of webinars on Mahābhārata that are being hosted by Department of Philosophy, University of Delhi, and Kamala Nehru College, University of Delhi. I hope all of you are doing well and keeping safe during these uncertain times of COVID-19 pandemic. We need to divert our minds and focus on something beyond the news, the statistics, and the kind of negative information that we are continuously dumping on our minds, at least for some time in a day. And this is how I believe this webinar series will help us all in diverting our minds from the concerns, with the information that we are dumping, getting dumped on our mind. And these webinars are being organized under the aegis of the Spark project, which is a scheme for promotion of academic and research collaboration, an initiative of Ministry of Education, Government of India. The title of the project is Yoga Consciousness in Mahābhārata and Bhagavad Gita, an ethical value for societal and political well-being. We are working as a team along with Professor Vishwa Adluri from Hunter College of City University of New York as our international principal investigator, Dr. Joydeep Bagchi from Germany, who is associated with Hindu University of America as a co-investigator from international side, and Dr. Geetesh Nirban, who is hosting this webinar, who is presently from Department of Philosophy, Kamala Nehru College, as the co-investigator from Indian side, and me, Professor Bala, head of the Department of Philosophy, University of Delhi, as the principal investigator from Indian side. Our extended team consists of Ms. Jayshree Jha and Ms. Anmolpreet Kaur, who are the research associates of the project, and Ms. Megha Kapoor and Ms. Deepshikha, who are the students of the Department of Philosophy, University of Delhi. As far as our project is concerned, it is our collaborative attempt to revisit the epic, to explore yoga consciousness as one of its underlying messages, while understanding how dharma, as a result of yoga consciousness in Mahābhārata, can be interpreted for political and societal well-being. Our attempt is not just to explore various aspects of Mahābhārata in the research mode, but also to reach out to diverse audience. That is how we have started this webinar series, to reach out to as many people as possible, not just to the focused research groups, but beyond that as well. These series of webinars are our humble attempt to make the various aspects of Mahābhārata reach the diverse audience who hold interest in the study of the epic. We started this series of webinar during the extreme phase of lockdown to engage minds with Mahābhārata. We have had the privilege of hosting scholars of repute from universities and organizations in India and abroad, wherein diverse topics related to Mahābhārata and Bhagavad Gita have been touched, ranging from societal and political well-being, ethical dilemmas, justice, consciousness, concept of karma, concept of punishment, environmental issues, dialogical consciousness, and even the place of curses and boons, and many other topics pertaining to the epic, all as an attempt to explore Mahābhārata for the human well-being. We are very honored today to have with us Dr. Soham. He will be speaking to us on glorifying Kṛṣṇa, a study of selected episodes from Kāśīrāma's Mahābhārata, as we have been trying to understand, and we have been repeating this. Mahābhārata is not just one text, though we use the term text, but it is not one text. And it is also that it is not one tradition. Okay, so there are many traditions and many texts and many renderings that we find of Mahābhārata in the country and beyond the country as well, because you find Mahābhārata traditions outside India as well. We have multiple versions and variations of both texts and performing traditions of Mahābhārata. That is how we understand Mahābhārata to be a living tradition. Among them, 16th century Kāśīrāma Das Bengali version retelling of Mahābhārata is a popular and influential one in Bengal. And it is characterized by very important and interesting deviations from the main text as well, in the sense of reducing the length of Bhagavad Gita, and also adding to the story of extending the story of Mohini avatar of Vishnu. These are some of the very interesting deviations, and from the Sanskrit rendering, original Sanskrit rendering. I don't want to use the word original even, the Sanskrit rendering, and that's what makes the work more fascinating. So today we are fortunate to have with us Mr. Dr. Soham, who would be talking to us and explaining to us the glory of Krishna as presented in this version of Mahābhārata. So without wasting much time, I request Dr. Gitesh to introduce the speaker and take the proceedings further. Over to you, Dr. Gitesh.
Thank you, Professor Bala. Namaskar to all. I must thank all of you for joining us today, even when the environment around is not so pleasant. And as Professor Bala said, at least once or twice in a day, we have to divert our attention towards something more positive, towards something more life-giving. And here we are with you today. May not be in great spirits, but yes, there to bring you back to the world of Mahābhārata. We're very honored to have amongst us today as our distinguished speaker, Dr. Soham Pain. Dr. Soham is an assistant professor and head at the Department of English at Swami Dhananjoy Das Kathiaba Mahavidyalaya, Bankura University at Bankura, West Bengal. He completed his PhD on Indian writings in English from Center for English Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi in 2018. Dr. Soham has presented in national and international conferences and published several research papers in scholarly journals and edited volumes. He's also an active translator. His translations of selected stories, poems, and letters by Tagore were included in Rabindranath Tagore and the Feminine, an anthology edited by Dr. Malashri Lal. His current areas of interest include post-colonial studies, psychoanalytical studies, and in particular, medieval and modern readings of the Mahābhārata. Dr. Soham was also a Fulbright Nehru doctoral fellow at the Department of Asian Studies, University of Texas at Austin in 2014 and 15. Today, he's going to be delivering an address on glorifying Krishna, a study of selected episodes from Kāśīrāma's Mahābhārata. We're all eagerly waiting to hear from you, Dr. Soham. I welcome you to take it over further.
Thank you so much, Professor Nirban, for those generous words. And I sincerely thank Hemanga Datta, who is currently very ill and hospitalized in Jaipur, for introducing me to Professor Nirban and to this distinguished gathering. And I feel so honored that I have been given such a prestigious platform. Thank you so much. I have named my paper Glorifying Krishna, a study of selected episodes from Kāśīrāma's Mahābhārata. Assuming that there would be quite a few non-Bengali listeners in the audience, I would like to say a few words about Kāśīrāma and his Mahābhārata before getting into the presentation proper. The Bengali poet Kāśīrāma lived towards the end of the 16th century, and his Mahābhārata was composed before 1642. He was a Kayastha by birth, and his father's name was Kamalakanta. He took lessons under the Brahmana guru Abhirama Mukhuti. Mukhuti is a corrupted form of the word Mukhopadhyay, and it was his guru who inspired him to compose the Mahābhārata. On the basis of the evidence gathered from several manuscripts, scholars have concluded that Kāśīrāma died after completing the first three parbas and to some extent the fourth. Several poets, ranging from Kāśīrāma's nephew Nandarama to Nityananda, an elder contemporary of Kāśīrāma, contributed towards the composition of the rest. Be that as it may, the text does reveal a remarkable coherence, to borrow Hildebrandt's words, which is also the characteristic of Vyasa's text. This coherence is not just limited to diction and style, but is also apparent from a consistent Vaishnava sensibility. The poet or the poets, I shall be using the poet in singular or sometimes the poets in plural, because we can never say conclusively whether this is the work of a single poet or not. The poet or the poets seem to leave no doubt about the fact that theirs is as much an attempt at a glorification of Krishna as an endeavor to make the difficult epic available to the general Bengali speaking public in an easy, recitable, vernacular version. What gives the text its composite form is perhaps the balance that the poets tried to strike between the characteristic grandeur of the original Sanskrit epic and their recourse to materials from popular oral traditions, pre existing Eastern Indian versions, and the Puranas. While the Sanskrit Mahābhārata, at least in its final form, is also a Vaishnava text upholding Krishna as the highest deity and Arjuna as the Bhakta par excellence, Kāśīrāma's work is written under the direct influence of Gauriya Vaishnavism, and therefore the source text that the poets often resort to for many of the episodes and myths is the Bhagavata Purana, the fountainhead of the medieval Bhakti movement, and a text that claims to be the great Vyasa's final and authoritative commentary on Krishna's Godhead, superseding all that has come earlier. Indeed, the very first couplet of Kāśīrāma's poem is nothing but a eulogy of Krishna. হরিনাম সর্বশাস্ত্র বীজ দ্বি অক্ষর অন্ত নাহি আদি নাহি বেদে অগোচর. The two-lettered name of Hari is the seed of all scriptures. It has no end, no beginning, and is beyond the knowledge of the Vedas. While after this brief eulogy, Kāśīrāma closely follows the frame and the sequence of events in Vyasa's Adiparvan, he once again reminds his readers that over and above the entertainment and moral embellishment that one receives from listening to the epic, the exercise also makes one realize Krishna's greatness. সবাঞ্ছিত ফল ইথে পায় নরগণ, হরিপদে মতি হয় জন্মে দিব্য জ্ঞান. Men acquire desired result from this listening. It leads to devotion to Hari's feet and bears divine knowledge. In this paper, I am going to critically analyze four episodes from the narrative in order to bring out the Vaishnava orientation of the poet and his work. The first episode is that of Draupadi's Swayamvara, the second one of Vivishana's visit to Hastinapura. Then I shall talk about the Ramu Pakhyana, and finally I shall talk about the Swargarohana Parva. So the first section, which is Draupadi's Swayamvara, I am getting into this analysis. In Kāśīrāma's poem, as in the Sanskrit original, Krishna enters into the narrative at Draupadi's Swayamvara. But in Vyasa's text, Krishna at this stage is completely human and is one of the many invited guests present at the occasion. He remains largely a silent observer as the events unfold, until at the very end when he is finally convinced that the two mighty Brahmanas are actually his cousins Bhima and Arjuna in disguise, at which point he intervenes and urges the kings to stop fighting and accept Arjuna as the legitimate groom of Draupadi. The episode is described as follows. And he gently restrained all the kings of the land. The maiden was won according to law. Thereupon the battle-wise kings turned away from the battle, and all the good princes went wonderingly back to their land. Vyasa's narrative mainly focuses upon the prowess of Arjuna and to some extent Bhima, and the description leaves no hint of any divine intervention by Krishna or by any other agent in the course of events. Arjuna does not seem to need any divine assistance at this stage. Krishna's role, too, when he finally intervenes, is limited to that of a speech act. He is certainly not the supreme godhead controlling the destiny of the assembled monarchs, and the fact that his advice is accepted by all only proves his influence as a skilled orator and diplomat. Kāśīrāma, a true Vaishnava, does not relinquish the opportunity to describe a ceremonious entry of the god Krishna into Drupada's hall. Unlike the human Yadava prince of the original epic, here Krishna makes his appearance in his divine form, grandly seated on Garuda and triumphantly blowing on his conch. গরুড়ারোহণে আইলেন জগন্নাথ, পাণ্ডব বিবাহ হেতু সপ্তবংশ সাত, শূন্যে রহিলেন খগপতি আরোহণে, করিলেন শঙ্খধ্বনি স্বয়ং নারায়ণে, পাঞ্চজন্য শঙ্খনাদে ত্রৈলোক্য পুরিল, পৃথিবীর যত বাদ্য সব লুকাইল, যত বিজ্ঞজন সভা মধ্যে বসেছিল, গোবিন্দ আগত দেখি সম্ভ্রমে উঠিল। Riding on Garuda came the Lord of the worlds, accompanied by the seven clans of Vrishnis for the marriage of the Pandavas. Having remained suspended in the in the void, seated on the king of birds, Narayana himself blew the conch. As the sound of the Panchajanya filled the three worlds, all the music of the world vanished. All the wise men seated in the hall rose when they saw that Govinda has arrived. It is at this point that the poet, instead of shifting the focus back to Draupadi and the Pandavas, takes the opportunity to create a dramatic argument between Krishna's supporters and opponents, much in emulation of a similar scene that occurs during the Rajasuya, which ultimately leads to Krishna's killing of Shishupala. Here too, it is Shishupala who first admonishes the kings for having shown respect to Krishna, followed by Jarasandha, who accuses Bhishma of having stooped before the wrong person. Bhishma then explains that Krishna is the Virata Purusha, who holds the Brahmanda in just one of his hair follicles, and that he is originally formless, Nirakara, but assumes human form by his Maya. Bhishma stresses the fact that he himself is too small a being compared to Shiva, Brahma, and Shesha, who constantly bow before Krishna respectively with 5, 4, and 1,000 heads. Jarasandha, however, is not convinced and keeps taunting Krishna, at which an irritated Bhishma says that he leaves the place where Krishna is bad-mouthed and takes his seat elsewhere in the hall. As the contest begins and assembled kings turn out to be failures one after another, Krishna advises Balarama to be patient and explains that they have not come to Kampilya to win the hands of Draupadi. A surprised Balarama argues that with the Pandavas having been burned to death at Varanavata, Krishna remained as the only prince who could win the difficult contest. Krishna, however, reveals that the Pandavas are alive and seated among the Brahmanas and urges Balarama and other Yadavas to stay out of the contest. Thus, in the text, Krishna is already aware of the reality, perhaps by his divine power, and has come to the occasion with the sole aim of uniting Draupadi with the Pandavas, something that is preordained. In the Bengali version, Krishna's role turns out to be that of Deus ex machina, whose active involvement ensures Arjuna's victory in the contest. In the course of the narrative, when other monarchs fail the test and it's Duryodhana's turn, taking possible clues from both the Pakhyana and the dicing sequence, Kāśīrāma makes Bhishma stand up and declare that he would take the test on behalf of his grandson, but is dissuaded due to the presence of Shikhandi before him. Then the onus is taken upon himself by Drona and after him by Ashwathama and Karna, but all of them fail the test as their weapons are thwarted and destroyed by Krishna's invisible Sudarshana. With the kings and princes having failed, now it's the turn of the Brahmins to try their luck, but Arjuna is still undecided and hesitant. It is Krishna's conscial vibrate which then restores Arjuna's self-respect and courage, and he goes ahead, recognizing the divine signal in Krishna's call. Arjuna pays due obeisance to Bhishma, Drona, and Krishna, and is ready to lift the bow. Both Bhishma and Drona are now convinced that the contestant is none other than Arjuna, and so is Balarama, who, however, is worried about Arjuna's safety as he is apprehensive of a possible protest from the assembled monarchs who would get enraged if they see a Brahmana win the contest. Krishna, however, assures Balarama of Arjuna's might and progress and points out that no harm can befall him whom Krishna himself has vowed to protect. Krishna said, "If wicked people commit injustice, what are you and I seated here for? If in my presence they inflict torture, who can blame the Lord of the worlds? I shall tear apart all the evil minded with my Sudarshana, just as in the past the Lord of the Bhrigus rendered the world bereft of Kshatriyas." The narrative then more or less follows the one in the Sanskrit version, but not without a final attempt at the glorification of Krishna. As 100,000 kings surround Arjuna and vow to kill him, Balarama is once more alarmed and tries to convince Krishna that Arjuna cannot overpower all of them alone. This time, Krishna agrees with his brother and decides to kill the enemy kings with his Sudarshana. At this, however, Balarama senses danger for his favorite disciple Duryodhana and dissuades Krishna from participating in the fight. The fight is a lengthy one, and the poet keeps narrating the feats of Arjuna and Bhima for no less than 4 sections. In contrast to Vyasa's description, where the skirmish is short lived and the kings soon surrender, here reinforcements fly in, and Drupada and Drishtadyumna are also seen fighting shoulder to shoulder with Arjuna and Bhima. Draupadi, however, is distressed and worried about her father and brother, and at Arjuna's behest, prays to Krishna so that the fight is over and peace is restored. Krishna blesses her and blows on the conch, and calls his own kinsmen and asks them to guard the Kampilya city on his behalf. When asked why he himself is not taking part in the battle, despite knowing that it is his cousin and best friend Arjuna who is in danger, he explains that he is only obeying the command of his elder brother Balarama. Eventually, peace is restored and Arjuna wins the hands of Draupadi. A close reading of this lengthy narrative leads us to certain conclusions. First of all, Krishna is unequivocally described as the Supreme Lord Jagannatha, and it is in this capacity that he acts here. He is fully conscious of his divine power and is already ready to use it for the sake of dharma. It is interesting that the Khandava episode is yet to take place, but Krishna is already in possession of the Sudarshana and he can work miracles by it. Secondly, Bhishma, Arjuna, and many others appear to already know the mystery of the Avatara, and at one point Krishna himself compares his present work to that of Bhargava Rama, an earlier Avatara. All the Yadavas, including Balarama, are fully aware of Krishna's divinity, and when they obey all his commands, they behave more like attendants or parikaras of the Supreme God as they are described within Gaudiya Vaishnava theology. Arjuna's motivation and success also primarily depend on Krishna's support, both perceptible and imperceptible, Prakata Leela and Aprakata Leela, and the episode reads like an early precedent to the Gita. Now we come to the second episode, that is of Vivishana's visit to Hastinapura. An interesting story the reader encounters in the Kasidasi Mahābhārata is that of Vivishana's meeting with Krishna and the Pandavas at Yudhishthira's Rajasuya. To begin with, Vibhishana is known to the Sanskrit Mahābhārata, which mentions that he accepted the suzerainty of Yudhishthira and paid tribute when requested by Sahadeva. The wise son of Madri went on to Bharukacha, and lordly king sent envoys to the great spirited Vibhishana Paulasta. Here the low spirited enemy tamer used diplomacy. The other happily accepted his decree. The prudent king consented to it as an act of time. So this was a quotation from the Mahabharata, from the Digvijaya section of the Mahabharata. This description, however, makes no reference to Krishna, and Vibhishana's bhakti towards Rama is not stressed. Vyasa also refrains from specifically mentioning whether Vibhishana was actually present at the Rajasuya. For the Bengali poet, on the other hand, it is precisely Vibhishana's eagerness to meet Krishna, the reincarnation of Rama, that motivated him to take the trouble to travel all the way to Hastinapura. For Vibhishana, the very invitation to Hastinapura is a veiled call of God to his devotee. Korile nijo bhakto bolia sharon. Upon reaching Hastinapura, he is astonished at the grandeur and scale of the event, but he immediately recognizes Krishna and pays his obeisance to him. The real purpose of his visit having been fulfilled, he then asks Krishna what is left to be done, in reply to which Krishna reminds him that he should pay a courtesy visit to Yudhishthira, the king and the host, and make a supplication. Vibhishana, however, says that he had accepted the invitation and paid his tribute solely out of his devotion towards Krishna, and with Krishna by his side, he needed the protection or support of none else. At this, Krishna explains that Yudhishthira is the very embodiment of Dharma, whose proximity absolves one from sin, and a great king who is known and highly respected in all the three worlds. Vibhishana is still not impressed and says that whatever Yudhishthira has achieved is the result of Krishna's blessings only, and half-heartedly agrees to follow Krishna to Yudhishthira's court, reasserting his resolve that he would bow before none except Krishna himself. But as the duo ventures to enter into the court, each of Satyaki, Ghatotkacha, Aniruddha, and Duryodhana, stationed respectively at the southern, eastern, northern, and western gates, bars Vivishana from entering, despite repeated requests from Krishna, citing that numerous kings have been waiting for days, expecting entry only when Yudhishthira's meeting with the immortals and celestials who are already inside would end. Only the luckiest few of the kings, such as Purujit and Shalya, have been allowed entry, and that too with explicit permission from Yudhishthira. Even after this unpleasant experience, however, Vibhishana is not convinced of Yudhishthira's royal power and greatness and turns down Krishna's request to bow before him. So here is a conversation between Krishna and Vibhishana. যখন করিব দৃষ্টি ধর্ম নরপতি ভূমিষ্ঠ হইয়া তুমি প্রণাম করিবে বিভীষণ বলে প্রভু নহে কদাচন. Krishna said, when we meet the Dharma king, bow before him lying on the earth. Vibhishana said, never. Krishna is distressed at Vibhishana's adamant stand and vows to make him pay obeisance to Yudhishthira. Brahma adi korabo noto, eba kon chhar. I shall make even Brahma bow before Yudhishthira. Then who is Vibhishana? As the story moves on, the duo meets Sahadeva, who shares the message that the immortals in the court are eager to have a darshana of Krishna. Krishna immediately agrees to go inside and seizes the opportunity to take Vibhishana along with him. The moment Krishna entered the hall, all the gods, celestials, and mortals present lay down on the floor to pay their obeisance to him. Krishna walked up to Yudhishthira's side, sat together with him on the same throne, and assumed his celestial form, the Vishwarupa. As everybody present in the hall bow before him, simultaneously they also bow before Yudhishthira seated next to him, thereby fulfilling his vow that he would make everybody pay obeisance to Yudhishthira. The scene ends with Krishna praising Yudhishthira as an ideal king and bhakta, acknowledging that he himself is enslaved to the latter's bhakti, and himself lying down and paying obeisance to an embarrassed and humbled Dharmaraja. Unlike the Swayamvara episode, where the Bengali poet made only some innovations to the original narrative, this particular story has no precedent in the Sanskrit text. The story seems to uphold the value of Vinaya or humility, the virtue per excellence according to the Gaudiya Vaishnava code of conduct. Gauriya Vaishnava ethics ordains that it's not enough for the ideal bhakta to have devotion towards Krishna, but should also have respect for other bhaktas. Vibhishana in this story, despite being a great devotee, lacks this virtue and even unveils his innate egoism when he turns down the request that comes from Krishna himself. Krishna too makes his bhakta learn humility and show respect to another bhakta, and goes even to the length of himself paying obeisance to Yudhishthira, who turns out to be the greater of the two bhaktas. Now I shall move on to the Ramopakhana section. The Ramopakhana in Vyasa's Mahābhārata forms a part of the Aranyaka Parvan and presents a condensed version of the Rama saga narrated by the sage Markandeya to an aggrieved Yudhishthira who laments his own lot and also the humiliation faced by Draupadi at the hands of Jayadratha. Though this version nominally acknowledges that Rama is an avatar of Vishnu, its depiction of Rama is by and large that of a human king. To quote Peter Scharf, textually the divine dimension of the story is not well integrated into the narrative of Rama in the Ramopakhana. Moreover, the narration of the story in response to Yudhishthira's question whether there is any man less fortunate than he affirms Rama's humanity and suggests that the story did not include its in its divine dimension when the Ramopakhana was inserted into the Mahabharata. The Ramopakhana does not include the re-entrance of Rama or his brothers into Vishnu's body. It ends with the return of Sita, Rama and Lakshmana to Ayodhya, followed by Rama's coronation and his performance of 10 Ashwamedha Vedic performances. The Ramopakhana never assumes Rama has the status of Vishnu, never in fact even identifying him explicitly with Vishnu. Therefore, the narration of the story of Rama in the Ramopakhana would proceed smoothly without including the divine dimension at all. Markandeya, having completed his narration, also does not emphasize Rama's divinity, but reiterates the point with which he had begun the narration, that even the greatest have to suffer, but justice would prevail at the end. And I am quoting from the Mahabharata. Look at Krishna Draupadi, who was abducted by the evil spirited Saindhava king, strong and drunk with power. But she was recovered by your great spirited brothers, who accomplished a difficult feat, and King Jayadratha was vanquished and captured. Rama recovered Vaidehi without such companions, and only after he had killed the 10-headed Rakshasa of terrible prowess in battle. Apes were his allies and black-faced bears, creatures of a different race. King, think that over in your mind. Therefore, tiger among the Kurus, do not grieve, for great spirited men like you do not grieve, enemy Bana. Before moving on to analyze the Ramopakhana as it is found in the Bengali text, it would perhaps not be out of place to ask the question, why did Kāśīrāma retain the Ramopakhana when he aimed at a summary version of the Mahabharata? Given the fact that his version of the epic is only one-fourth of Vyasa's in length, what motivated him to dispense with many other stories, legends, or details and find a place for the Rama saga, which is neither part of the main narrative nor any less known that it required popularization? The answer once again lies in Kāśīrāma's Vaishnava affiliation. How could he control his desire to take a detour and glorify Vishnu's former manifestations, something for which the epic narrative allows little space? Kāśīrāma's indebtedness to the Bhagavata is nowhere more explicit than in his interesting handling of the Ramopakhana. In his version, Markandeya is cautious and conscious of the divinity of Rama from the very beginning, and at the very outset he mentions Lokhirupa Janakonondini Nam Sita, Onadi Purush Jar Poti Narayan, Horiya Loilo Tare Lankar Rabon. Of the form of Lakshmi was the daughter of Janaka, Sita by name. whose husband was the beginningless Purusha Narayana, was abducted by Ravana of Lanka. Yudhishthira, in response, asks, জন্মিলেন কি হেতু মর্তে নারায়ণ কিমতে তাহার সীতা হরিল রাবণ. Why did Narayana take birth in the mortal world? How did Ravana abduct his Sita? The stage for the drama is thus set. Markandeya commences his narration not by mentioning the lineage and exploits of Ravana, but with the story of Jaya and Vijaya, the gatekeepers of Vaikuntha, who were cursed by the sages to be born as mortals on earth. Kāśīrāma closely follows the narrative as it appears in the Bhagavata and narrates Vishnu's assurance to assume avatars to deliver the two from their sins. The first birth of Jaya and Vijaya as the Daityas Hiranyaksha and Hiranyakashipu, the killing of Hiranyaksha by Vishnu in Varaha form, the birth of Prahlada, Hiranyakashipu's failed attempts to kill Prahlada, and finally the death of Hiranyakashipu at the hands of Narasingha. For the present paper, it would suffice to mention only one thing about this lengthy story. The poet often uses the names Vishnu and Krishna interchangeably, thereby implying that Krishna is not just an avatar, but Vishnu himself. Having completed the story of Hiranyaksha and Hiranyakashipu, Markandeya goes on to narrate the story of the second birth of Jaya and Vijaya, this time as Ravana and Kumbhakarna, and eventually comes to the story of Rama's exile, Sita's abduction, and the killing of Ravana. This part is mostly faithful to Krittivasa's Bengali Ramayana. It is significant that after having concluded his story, Markandeya emphatically mentions that Jaya and Vijaya have been reborn yet again as Yudhishthira's contemporaries Shishupala and Dantavakra, and that the former has already been killed by Krishna at Yudhishthira's Rajasuya. Kāśīrāma's handling of the Ramu Pakhyana therefore deviates to a great degree from its original purpose of consoling the aggrieved monarch and turns out to be a eulogy of Vishnu's greatness and might. And now I come to the final section of my paper. This is the Swargarohana section. The Mahaprasthanika and the Swargarohana Parvans in the Sanskrit epic are short and permeated by a feeling of somberness. As Kevin McGrath puts it, these concluding books of the epic are of an increasingly otherworldly nature and take the narrative of the poem away from the political and material earth. Another significant point noted by the eminent scholar in connection with the last books is as follows. Again, I am quoting from McGrath. Arjuna is the son of Indra and is thus half divine, just like his four half siblings, whereas Krishna, his maternal cousin, is completely human and worldly in the epic, being born of human parents. It is Krishna who perishes a mortal death in the Maushala Parvan. Arjuna himself experiences death simply as a physical collapse, but then his embodied being reappears in heaven in the company of his half brothers and King Yudhishthira. This is, however, not to say that the epic undermines Krishna's role and significance in the lives of the Pandavas. Commenting on the post-war books of the epic, McGrath acknowledges, once the heroic Krishna, the spectacularly adept charioteer of warrior Arjuna, had departed and no longer drove for him, Arjuna becomes increasingly feeble, possessing a diminishing martial stamina and vitality. When Krishna finally dies, Arjuna becomes listless and feckless as a warrior. An authority no less than Vyasa explains to Arjuna that Krishna was the real source of all the power the Pandavas had, and that Krishna's demise also heralded their own. This is the realization that motivates Yudhishthira in the original epic to acquire a stoic resignation and undertake what the epic calls the Great Departure. With Kāśīrāma's poem, however, the situation is different. First of all, instead of resorting to the original version, the poet draws his material from the Bhagavata Purana. As a result, there is no separate Mahaprasthanika section, and the entire sequence from the initial breakdown of Yudhishthira upon learning about the demise of Krishna up to his final act of departure is clubbed together with the preceding Maushala Parva. Incidentally, the Maushala Parva too in the Bengali Mahābhārata is explicitly modeled on the Bhagavata version, but unfortunately I already have a paper on that, so I cannot repeat the points here. It would have been nice if I could have spoken on the Maushala Parva in this context, but I regret that. In this poem, Yudhishthira, more than a stoic, behaves like a bhakta and decides to embark on his journey in order to get reunited with Krishna. His departing advice to his subjects is also a highly devotional one. Krishna bhajo, Krishna chinto, Krishna korosar, bhebe dekho Krishna bina goti nahi ar. Adore Krishna, meditate on Krishna, make Krishna the center of your life. Think about it. There is no resort other than Krishna. Kāśīrāma's narration of the Pandavas' journey differs markedly from Vyasa's treatment of the same. The Bengali poet has introduced several adventures in the main storyline, including that of a battle between Bhima and a Rakshasi and of an abduction of Draupadi by a Daitya named Meghanada. All these unnecessary exaggerations have only degraded the quality of the narration and taken away the grave and somber feeling associated with the entire journey motive. Poet critic Buddhadev Bose has disparagingly attacked the style and form of this section and lamented that Kāśīrāma has made a prahasana of the Swargarohana. Indeed, this section contains much that can be dubbed as Gramyata according to Sanskrit aesthetics. It must, however, be fair to mention in passing that Kāśīrāma is not the only author of the epic who can be accused of having distorted the original appeal and content of the Mahaprasthanika and Swargarohana Parvans. An earlier poet, Kavindra Parameshwara, is also accountable for the same. Kāśīrāma's version closely follows Kavindra's. Therefore, the onus should perhaps fall on the lesser poets who contributed to the completion of Kāśīrāma's text. Possibly they were trying to remain loyal to the traditions and versions that enjoyed local popularity. Be that as it may, what is significant for the purpose of the present research is that here Yudhishthira, upon reaching Indra's heaven, is taken to the worlds of Brahma, Shiva, and Vishnu. In Vaikuntha, Vishnu's world, the king is granted a vision of the four-handed Lord, flanked by his two consorts, Lakshmi and Saraswati, and it is he who guides the king to the dark place where his close ones are being punished for their sins. From this point, it is Krishna himself, now in the form of Vishnu, who replaces Indra and Dharma as Yudhishthira's host, escort, and tester. He explains to Yudhishthira that his kinsmen are suffering because of their own sins, but would eventually attain heaven, and that Yudhishthira himself also had to have a vision of Naraka in order to absolve himself from the one untruth he spoke to Drona. Once Yudhishthira is thus freed from his sin, Vishnu orders Garuda to take him to Shweta Dvipa, where the king shreds off his mortal body, is reunited with his kinsmen, and sings a hymn to the 10 avatars of Vishnu. Krishna too in his turn embraces the king and declares that the latter is his very life. Govinda bolen Raja tumi momo pran. The poem thus ends on a completely devotional note, triumphant declaration of Krishna's supreme divinity and simultaneously upholding the eternal bond between God and his devotee. Thank you.